So the last time we were here, we were talking about making judgments. So we were talking about Linda, the feminist bank teller. So we talk about Dave the engineer and Linda the feminist bank teller. So the conjunction fallacy, just as a reminder, is just the belief that a combination of two events is going to be more likely than either one on its own. So people tend to rate Linda as being a feminist bank teller as being more probable than either just being a bank teller or just being a feminist. So the idea here is that we believe that the combination of these two is more probable. Now, if you know anything about probability, if you want to combine both of these, they have to multiply. And you know what happens when you multiply decimals like probabilities? The product gets smaller. So the probability of a feminist bank teller is actually going to be less than either just being a bank teller or just being a feminist. So now we're going to move on to talking about a few different heuristics and biases that kind of come into play when we're judging the likelihood of events or whether or not people fit a certain class. So the availability heuristic is basically we judge the likelihood of an event by figuring out how readily available it is in our memory. So here is a really dark example. Which of these is going to be the more common cause of death? Is it murder or is it suicide? It is suicide. Now, I think because we're paying more attention to mental health than we did in the past, more people are going to be more likely to get that right. But at least in the past, before this was something that we talked about pretty openly, more people are going to be more likely to say murder. So here's an example that is less dark. Is there anybody here that's afraid of flying in a plane? Is anybody here afraid of flying? Avriana, you're afraid of flying? Can I ask you a question? Do you ride in a car?
Yep.
Are you scared when you ride in a car?
Yes.
Okay. How about if you're driving the car?
No.
Oh, okay. Now that's a little different. So most people who are afraid of flying have absolutely no problem getting in a car and driving. Now, here's why I find that interesting. You're a lot more likely to die in a car crash than you ever are in a plane crash. Now, some of that has to do with control issues. When you're flying in a plane, you are unless you have a pilot's license, which most of us do not, you're basically giving up your control to somebody that you can't even see. You can't even go in the cockpit anymore. I went to the cockpit when I was a kid. I got pilot wings. But the idea here basically being you're giving up control to somebody that you can't see. But so some of it is a control thing. Like if I'm in control of my driving, I feel safer than when I give that control up to somebody else. How many of you feel safer when you're driving compared to when someone else is driving? That's because other people are worse drivers than you. Isn't that right? Yeah, you know who believes that? Everybody. So part of it is a control thing. But the other thing is that generally, y'all, when a plane crash happens, it's a big deal. It makes news because it's really, really rare. In contrast, car crashes are so common that they don't make the news unless they're really bad. So what happens when we're trying to draw up instances of car crashes and plane crashes? Our instances of plane crashes pop up more in our mind. And because of that, we think they're more common than they actually are. Dr. Gilchrist understands this. Both times that Cotty took a trip to Barcelona that I was on, there was a plane crash the day we were coming back, both times. So in 2015, when I was leaving to go back to the States from Barcelona with Cotty, the Germanwings disaster happened in the Alps. And then when we were in 2019 flying back, the Ethiopian Boeing Air Max crash happened. So yeah, somebody told me that's a sign that I shouldn't go to Barcelona anymore. They said, you shouldn't fly to Barcelona. And I said, never. I will always go to Barcelona. It is my favorite place. But let's talk a little bit about why the availability heuristic happens. There are two different mechanisms that Hertwig and colleagues actually proposed back in 2005. One of them is what's called availability by recall, where you are actually trying to retrieve instances. I would argue that most of us don't necessarily do this. I think what most of us do is what is referred to as fluency, how easy it is to bring relevant instances into our minds. We're not actively trying to search for it. It's more based the ease with which things come up. Those plane crashes come to mind much, much more easily than car crashes do. But here's something kind of interesting. Adriana, did you need me to go back? I can. Okay, don't be shy. You won't hurt my feelings. I know I talk fast. I've been talking nonstop, so this is going to be like 2 straight hours of talking. I don't know what to do with myself. I mean, I say that, and yet I teach Tuesday, Thursday classes back to back, which is 2.5 hours of talking. So really, this is not a challenge. Y'all didn't lose power up in Kansas City, did you? Lucky. Huh? Oh, okay, nice. Okay. Yeah, we had the power out to the entire city yesterday. So, and it went almost all the way into Barton County. So it's not the first time we've had this happen. Someday I'm going to have to tell y'all the time that we lost water because of a broken, rusty water main that needed to be repaired. We almost didn't have tap water for like a week. Yeah. Welcome to living in a tiny rural town. It has its perks. It has some drawbacks. Okay, so let's try something. Which last name is more common in the United States? Is it Bush or is it Stevenson? Okay. So I'm going to ask the people on who are zooming in. Okay, let's see. Okay, Geneva said Stevenson. Anybody else who's zooming in? What's more common, Bush or Stevenson? Stevenson, overwhelmingly Stevenson. Is there anybody here who agrees here in class? Does anybody say Bush? It's okay if you do. Turns out Stevenson is correct. So here's what's really interesting. This is a case where the availability heuristic should absolutely be working, right? We've had 2 former presidents with the last name Bush. We had another presidential candidate who was also named Bush from the same family. So because of the availability heuristic, you should be coming up with Bush examples much more easily than Stevenson examples. But here's what's kind of interesting. Oppenheimer actually found in 2004 that people don't actually use the availability heuristic here. And they correctly recognized that Stevenson is a much more common name than Bush. Now, this is helpful. It means that even though we use these heuristics, we also recognize that sometimes something is familiar to us or comes to our mind quickly, not because it's more common, but because it's famous. So we can recognize that familiarity is not always due to frequency or commonness, and we can basically overcorrect. Yeah, they like to slip sometimes. I get it. Sometimes I pull mine out, so I'm like, I'm feeling suffocated. So sometimes my students will see me hold it up above my chin just for a second. This lecture today was brought to you by Dr. G Fuel. Caffeine came out today. I know, Dr. Gilchrist, no, don't do it. Don't drink the caffeine. Too late. I'm doing all right. Everybody good? All right. So I want to talk a little bit about Tversky and Kohler's support theory. So here's what's kind of interesting. Any given event is going to appear more or less likely depending on the description that you give it. So here's kind of what that means. So basically, you can't remember all the possible information that you need to make a judgment. So generally, if I say I'm on vacation and somebody died, here's what's actually kind of interesting. So what is the likelihood that you will die on vacation? People will tend to give a certain percentage to that. Here's what's interesting. If you suddenly make that more specific, what are the odds you'll die of a heart attack while on vacation? All of a sudden, people actually say that that is more likely than just dying on vacation. So any given event will appear more or less likely depending on the description. So more general descriptions, like what are the odds you die on vacation? We're going to be like, well, that's too vague. That's too general. But what are the odds you're going to die of a heart attack on vacation? More explicit events like dying of a heart attack on vacation are actually judged as being more likely than just dying on vacation. And Tversky and Kohler basically said that this is because when we put things in very explicit terms, we are drawing attention to the less obvious aspects of the situation. And additionally, we are human beings with memory limitations. You can't remember everything. And so if we make it more explicit, they're going to focus on what they are explicitly told. They're going to focus on the aspects described in the question. So instead of thinking of all of the different ways they could die, they solely focus on heart attack. Okay. So here's kind of an example. So back in the early 2000s, everybody talked a lot about terrorism. Gee, I wonder why. For a variety of reasons. But Mandel basically has asked people to give estimates of a terrorist attack. So they either got a general event, a terrorist attack in the next 6 months. So they asked people, what are the odds there will be a terrorist attack in the next 6 months? Or they got an explicit event. What are the odds that there is a terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda in the next 6 months? Or what are the odds of there being a terrorist attack not by Al-Qaeda in the next 6 months? So both of these are much more specific, and the more explicit scenarios yielded much higher probabilities, despite the fact that that is not possible. A more general event is always going to be more probable than a specific one. And so one of the things you'll find when you're in your textbook, I actually gave more detail here on support theory than your textbook does, because we don't fully understand how or why this works. It just does. Sometimes the answer is, I don't know. And by the way, folks, I know that you have a homework assignment that is due on the 16th. I'm going to go ahead and push that back to the 20th so that we have time to cover the task before I ask you to do it. And I will remind you of that tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but on Friday as well. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about heuristics. So one of the things that is very, very clear, and I actually just spent the past hour talking about, we are so prone to biases in a variety of different contexts, and that's one of the things that's really helpful about heuristics. So when we're talking about things like stereotypes, or when we are talking about errors that we make or misjudging people, oftentimes that's going to be due to the biases in our thinking, kind of what's told to us by our larger culture. And this has a lot of influence in a variety of fields that go far beyond psychology. So I think talking about heuristics and the fact that your mind wants to simplify the world around it is a huge deal. But there are some potential issues that talking about heuristics brings up. So we know that people use heuristics, but why do they work the way as they do? It could be that people have difficulties with judgments, not because of heuristics, but because they don't understand the problem. A lot of the problems that I have presented to you here don't really look like everyday life problems. Here's a description of Dave. Is he an engineer? How often does that come up for you? Or Linda, the feminist bank teller. How often do these things come up for you in that way? This is not how judgments work in everyday life. So there are some issues with ecological validity. They don't look like how we do these things in everyday life. And then finally, and I think this is really important, we talked about individual differences before. Everybody is different in terms of when they're more or less likely to use heuristics or make errors in their judgments. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about those individual differences, though, and we really should. Everybody's different. It takes all kinds, as I often like to say. Okay. Are y'all ready for more creepy probability problems? You're like, please no. Although Robin seems to be really good at them. Do you like math, Robin? We like people who like math. We also like people who don't like math. All are welcome here. I will say research methods is easier when you like math. I will say that, but it's okay if you don't. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about some work by Gerd Gigerenzer, which, first of all, he has an awesome name. Come on, Gerd Gigerenzer. He wrote a book, I want to say a couple of years ago. Let me see if I can find it. I want to see when it was published. It's called Gut Feelings. And it came out in 2007. And it's really similar. It's really similar to Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blank. But I'd say pick Gigerenzer's book because Gigerenzer actually does work in this field. Always support the researcher. Gigerenzer has identified a few what are called fast and frugal heuristics. So what we do in these cases is we engage in rapid processing of very relatively little information. And so when we're doing these judgments, we do what Gigerenzer refers to as a take the best strategy. So there are three different components to this particular strategy. The first component is basically what we refer to as a search rule. So we search some of the different cues that we have in memory in order of their validity. We stop after we find the cue that helps us make our decision. And then we make our decision rule and we basically choose an outcome based on that. So take the best is basically take the best, ignore the rest. So pick the one that best fits and then throw out anything that doesn't. So for example, we're going to talk about one called the recognition heuristic. So your book talks about one of these, and I'll kind of use these three components as a way to kind of work through this. So one of the things that we're going to judge is city size. So we're going to judge the size of cities. And so there is one potential heuristic that you could use, and one of them is that cities with cathedrals tend to be larger than ones that don't. So if I'm asking you whether Herne or Cologne, both are cities in Germany, which one is larger? Well, you know, some people know that there's a cathedral in Cologne, but I've never heard of a cathedral in Herne. So I might assume that Cologne is the correct answer. So here's how this would kind of work. So my search rule is basically, I'm trying to search the particular cue, which in this case is a cathedral, whether there are cathedrals. My stop rule is basically if I figure out that Cologne has a cathedral and the other city, Herne, doesn't, and then I make my decision rule. So this is how that would kind of work. Now let's try another example with something called the recognition heuristic. So this is one of the other fast and frugal heuristics. So let's say, for example, that I ask you to determine which city is larger. Which city is going to be larger, Columbus or Pella? Now, how many of you have heard of Columbus? It's a city in Ohio, and it's actually much, much larger than you think. Like when I went to Columbus, I'm like, this is one of the top 10 largest cities in the United States. What? It's Ohio. But people recognize the name Columbus. How many of you recognize the name Pella? You probably only know Pella if you've been to Iowa. So there is a Pella in Iowa. So we basically assume that if we recognize the name, that that city must be larger than a city that we don't recognize. And generally that works pretty well. Most of you are going to have an easier time remembering a city, knowing that there's a city called Atlanta versus my hometown, Lakeland. Some of you have never heard of Lakeland. And so because of that, you can assume that Atlanta is larger than Lakeland, which absolutely is. We are talking about a metro population of 600,000, or actually 4 million versus it's like 4 million versus like 100,000. Both are still large compared to Nevada. Okay, so something else that Gigerenzer often talks about are natural frequencies. So one of the big problems that a lot of these judgments and a lot of the problems that I've shown you is that information is often presented in percentages or fractions. So we talked about the cab company last time. 85% of the cabs in the city are green. 15% of the cabs are blue. Or the example that I brought up with mammograms. If a woman finds a lump in her breast, about 80% of the time it's benign. So when we talk about these things in terms of percentages or fractions, who among you gets freaked out? Who here gets freaked out when they see percentages or fractions? Don't be shy, there is no judgment here. Dr. Gilchrist still likes you if you don't like math. So what ends up happening is that we start ignoring those base rates because we get freaked out by percentages or fractions. I'm like, I gotta invert the thing to do this? How do I do that? I'm scared. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. I see hands. So I'm like, it kind of looked like a hand raise. So I'm like, hand, let me see it. So we do tend to find that Gigerenzer and Hoffridge actually found that when we put these in terms of frequencies that are whole numbers rather than percentages or fractions, people tend to do better. So let's go back to our Linda the Feminist Bank Teller problem. If we focus on this, how many out of 100 people were bank tellers, fitting Linda's description? How many out of 100 were feminists? How many out of 100 were feminist bank tellers? All of a sudden, when you put them in these whole numbers, the conjunction fallacy plummets. So this is a good thing. All right, but we are going to talk about a scary problem that has to do with percentages. So get ready. And one thing that I will mention, just because I'm telling you the answer to these does not mean that I'm actually good at figuring out these probabilities. I just have the answer in front of me, and it's kind of like the Alex Trebek effect. People assumed that Alex Trebek was really smart because he's the one who's got all the answers, but that doesn't mean he necessarily knows them. I'm bringing all this up because I'm playing trivia tonight with Zoom trivia with a bunch of freshmen, and I get to ask all the questions. I'm gonna look so smart. Might try to push them to see if we can do a Simpsons themed pack, but then I remember The Simpsons has been on the air for longer than many of you have been alive. And to put this into perspective, Dr. Gilchrist was 7 years old when the first episode of The Simpsons came out, and she has been watching it ever since. Like, we keep watching the show and I'm just like, dang, I'm old. Or actually not that old, but I'm like, dang, I'm old. Do you also crack your neck?
No.
That's a good thing.
My sister can do it.
You can pop, you can wreck an artery that way. Like, people have given themselves aneurysms because of that. Yeah, don't pop your neck so hard. Be very careful. I saw you doing it. Be careful. Your head is very important. Keep it attached to your neck so it doesn't fall off. Okay. So here is an example that comes from medical students that are basically being given different types of diagnostic tests. And they were either expressed to them in probabilities, which are in green, and natural frequencies. So a diagnosis of colorectal cancer, breast cancer, ankylosing spondylitis, phenylketonuria. And usually generally what you can see here is that the medical students tend to do much better in general when these are expressed in natural frequencies. That's especially true for, take a look at colorectal cancer. Look at that massive difference. So you are not even getting like 10% correct here, but once we put it into natural frequency, 75%, and that's a big deal because colorectal cancer can be pretty deadly. And in general, I'm actually not really surprised at either ankylosing spondylitis or phenylketonuria. Both of these are pretty rare. And in this case, we're actually still learning more about it. Okay, so let's talk about whether or not natural frequencies always help. So do not write this problem down. It has scary percentages. So there's an 80% probability that a woman with breast cancer will have a positive test. There is a 9.6% probability that a woman without cancer will test positive. So that's your false positive rate. The base rate of breast cancer is 1%. Given a positive test, what is the probability that a woman has breast cancer? So even when we put this into natural frequencies, people still make mistakes. So it turns out, given a positive test, the probability that a woman has breast cancer is only about 7.8%. Remember, you got to keep that base rate into account. But most people will say that there is a 63% chance, and that's with natural frequencies. Because when we talk about false positive rates and chances of a positive test and the base rate, that's a lot of information for people to grapple with. So how do we get people to actually use those base rates? This is kind of the role that causal knowledge plays. So Krinsky and Tenenbaum in 2007 basically presented a modified problem. So listen to this. There is a 6% chance that a woman without cancer will have a dense but harmless cyst. This happens to me all the time. This looks like a cancerous tumor and can result in a positive test. So we add this information that it's possible that somebody could have this and they'd get a false positive. You do get less base rate neglect, but the estimates are just below 50. So we've gone from like 60% positive, like a 60% chance that people erroneously identified, down to less than 50. They need to be down at like 7%. So this is similar to what we do every day. Now, this was an example that I wrote many years ago. If a friend has a cough, is it a cold or is it lung cancer? It's probably COVID. No, I'm kidding. Odds are still pretty much likely that it's going to be a cold. Like, I cough all the time. I cough every day. It's the fun part of having seasonal allergies and postnasal drip. I wake up every morning with a cough. So if a friend has a cough, do you have a cold or do you have lung cancer? WebMD has caused a lot of problems in this regard. We always think we have something serious when we don't. But we do this all the time and we don't even think about it. We think about the base rate. If my friend starts hacking, I'm going to say, you know, odds are pretty good you've probably got something respiratory, but my mind's not going to jump to, oh my gosh, it's lung cancer. So we do this all the time. We just don't think about it in terms of fractions and probabilities. So why do we use heuristics? Now, I will mention that most of the judgments that we make are harmless. So, for example, I judged yesterday that I should bring an umbrella to work. That was a smart decision, even though I never ended up actually using it. I made the decision to get to work a little quicker, and I judged that it would be better to be at work early. I beat the rate. I judged that it would probably be a bad idea to stick around when there was no power and no water at Cotty. So I went home. And then I judged that I would stay put until the power came back on, and then classes got canceled, and then the power came back on. So sometimes most of the time, we're making judgments on our intuition, on our gut instinct. And yes, I am slapping my stomach right now. We use a gut instinct. Most of the time, we don't need a lot of really critical thought, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we need to make a big judgment. I am still debating on whether or not I want to go to Florida and visit my family at Christmas. That's a pretty risky choice. And even though I would be driving and by myself a majority of the time, it's still something I have to think very deeply about. So remember that we have a dual process system. We have something that is intuitive and automatic and very fast and not always consciously aware, that we're not always consciously aware of. We also have another system. It's very analytical, it's very controlled, and it's rule-based. It's a very, very slow system. This is our conscious system. If you want to learn more about this, by the way, the library has a copy of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And frankly, I think the book's like way too long. It's like, the book is like this thick. It's like almost as thick as my head. But it's pretty detailed, but it's basically talking about these two systems. We have this automatic fast acting system that is intuitive. We're not always consciously aware of it. I would argue that it's this system that is responsible for a lot of the stereotypes that we have about people, the oversimplifications that we have about people. And then we have this slower acting, more controlled, rule-based system. And that actually comes from your own experiences and from learning. And so the goal is to make sure that system one doesn't run away with itself. System two sometimes needs to keep system one in check. So here is a case where we are looking at different types of problems. So a fast-acting system and a slow-acting system are basically going to change how we process things. So the type of problem that we get really matters. So one of the things that we find is that we can get problems that are what are known as incongruent problems. They don't really fit with what we know. We have congruent ones which tend to work the best. And then we have neutral problems. And what we tend to find here is that our time, we spend about the same time reading all of these problems. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that our system kind of knows that if it takes a long time to make a decision, there's probably something about that problem, because notice that your time to make a decision tends to be pretty quick for both congruent or neutral problems. But if you are taking a long time on a problem, that might mean that you're dealing with something that you don't fully understand. Okay, so with the time that we have left, and I'm glad I opened this up and I also put these in the notes today, so I'm really glad. Who wants to talk about some coin flips? Look at my pretty slides. This is back from when I had a Surface tablet. I had a Surface tablet. I'm like, look at the new PowerPoint design. So this is meant to be shown on a tablet, and it shows. I am getting an iPad very soon and doing digital drawing, so I might learn how to design my own slides. So maybe I will make hand-drawn brain slides. We shall see. But we're going to talk about decision making. So one of the things that I think is really important to note, you know what? in all the years that I've taught cognitive psychology and all the years I've worked in cognitive psychology, do you know what I think really, I think is the most important thing that I've learned from cognitive psychology? People are not rational. We have this huge emphasis on rationality, and odds are you have somebody in your life who prides themselves on rationality and logic. I live with one. Like rationality at all costs. But if there's one thing I've learned, we are not as rational as we like to be. Now, sometimes we can be. We can be as rational as the circumstances allow us to be, but to act like we're cold, unthinking robots that don't use our emotions or shortcuts or biases to help us make judgments or decisions is just untrue. So when we talk about making decisions, the traditional view was that decision-making is always a rational behavior. If that were true, some of us would not have like ice cream for breakfast if decision-making were always rational. There's a part of me that wants to joke that for extra credit, you should show me why eating ice cream for breakfast is a rational decision. It may not be a rational decision, but it sure is fun sometimes. So a normative theory, so the original theories of decision-making are what we call normative theories. They are focused on how we should make decisions. So when you think about normative, think of should, or think of norms, things that we should do. So right now we got norms like wear a mask, don't stand too close to people, do the Batman when you cough. Actually, no, I think we call it the Dracula. Do the Dracula when you cough, hold your cape up. So one of the earliest theories of decision-making is what is called utility theory. We are trying to get the best possible gain out of a decision, or what we refer to as maximizing utility. What this basically means is that we have an expected utility, so what we expect to gain from the decision, and that is a product of the probability of the outcome multiplied by the utility. So for example, if I flip a coin and I get a certain amount of money on it, that's the probability of a certain coin flip times the payout. And decisions are basically treated as gambles. Okay. So we're going to try something. So a general principle in risky decision making is going to be this. You need to maximize the odds of a gain, and you need to minimize the odds of a loss. That's what's really critical here. So according to a normative theory, the decision that you make should lead to the best possible gain and a minimal loss. So you should be focused on how much you can win and try to minimize how much you can lose. So we're going to end it with just one probability thing. I promise. You're like, no more probability, Dr. Gilchrist, but this one's easy. It's coin flips. Coin flips are easy. And I apologize for those of you who are zooming in. I realize I kind of got like a almost psychotic look on my face, and I'm like, coin flips are easy. Okay, so let's try something really quick. So I want you to write these down, and we're going to bring these in next time, and we're going to talk about them on Friday. So scenario number one, I will pay you $200 for flipping a heads up coin. If it's tails, you owe me $100. You're like, I'm not giving you my money, Dr. Gilchrist. So I'll pay you $200 for a heads up coin. If it's tails, you pay me $100. So I want you to answer the first question. Do you want to play that game? Yes or no? So it's a simple yes or no question. The second scenario, would you take a sure gain of $800, or would you take an 85% probability of gaining $1,000 and a 15% probability of gaining nothing? So which of those would you rather take? Would you take the sure gain or the risky gain? And then finally, in scenario 3, would you take a sure loss of $800 or an 85% probability of losing $1,000 and a 15% probability of losing nothing? So have these questions, go ahead and write down your answers right now, and we will talk about your responses next time. Odds are pretty good you will not be as rational as you think you are, because nobody is. So scenario 1, say either yes or no. Scenario 2, either pick the sure gain or the risky gain. For scenario 3, pick the sure loss or the risky loss. And we will talk about your answers at the beginning of class on Friday. All right, folks, that is all I have right now. This will be up on YouTube and recorded very shortly. We didn't show any videos, so no copyright claim, yay us. And I will see you here on Friday. Have a great day. If you're chilly, stay warm, and I will see you next